evaluating our belief system. Most of my contemporaries outside of yeshiva studied in college and confronted different ideas which ate or tried to eat at the basis of their beliefs. Some people never thought about it, and so therefore it really didn't have an effect. But people who are thinkers would be troubled after studying history, especially Near Eastern history, archaeology, especially the Egyptian period and the biblical period, and then cosmology regarding the age of the world and the origin of the world. These parallel streams, the stream of the soft sciences and the pattern of the cosmologists, biologists, physicists, astronomers, they give an image of a world that emerged many billions of years ago and doesn't seem to have any rhyme or reason. Things just happen. Cataclysmic events took place for no reason. Other things emerged, and finally we have come and emerged as the dominant being upon our earth, a tiny little piece of rock in a huge solar system in a much bigger galaxy, among many clusters of galaxies in an ever-expanding universe. And this doesn't seem like the ordered existence that we find when we study our Torah, also known as the Bible. And of course, there's a lot of ink that's been written. I'm not going to go over those things and those arguments. But we have to face the modern generation, the generation for which all is accessible. You can run, but you can't hide, they say. Eventually, people who deal with others, who educate others, confront some element of what I just talked about. So how is it in 2020 I can sit before you and express my belief in an ancient document for which many of you say there is no basis for, there's no historical corroboration that this ever took place? So how could you believe so firmly in this ancient document and in the culture that brought this document into reality? And there's a lot in this, but being that I'm not smart enough to have all the answers, I thought at one time I could find the answers myself, and realized in order to find the answers you have to have a lot more knowledge in archaeology, in world history, in physics, in biology. It's far greater than the cursory, superficial knowledge that I gleaned during my years in high school and college. So where does a person go for truth? Where could a person go to negate the ideas of the intelligentsia? So first of all, you have to be a skeptic. I'm by nature a skeptic. Just because someone says something doesn't mean that it's true. Just because a professor with nice little glasses, with a nice vest, gets up and tells you this is the way, this is the timeline, this is what happened, this is how things got to where we are now, you have to ask yourself and ask the professor, how do you know? And he'll huff and puff and say, well, this is the conclusion of thousands of scholars and so on and so forth. And you hit a raw nerve, because the basis of what he thinks he knows is really up in the air. There are a lot of assumptions that people make in their assertions of timelines of developments and so on and so forth. Let's start with one of them. Ancient history is fixed. Certainly the Egyptian history, the chronology of the Egyptians, could be wrong, they say, within a year or 2 or 10, but not in terms of centuries. Is that true? The answer is 100% false. The dating system is based upon the writings of several historians. They create a starting point, and they go backwards and forwards from that particular point, and that becomes the basis of chronology. Is the chronology accurate? I turn you to Rabbi Alexander Hull, who proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the basis of chronology of the middle part of the Egyptian Empire is false. The discussions, the determinations, who was where and what, who did Alexander defeat? Was it a descendant of Darius, or was it Darius the Great himself? And if it was Darius the Great, then you distort the chronology of the history of the world by about 164 to 168 years. Professor Hull, Rabbi Hull rather, has proven Alexander defeated Darius the Great. He proved that the timeline that is given for certain events is also based on faulty knowledge. The timeline of the ancient world, for the large part, was established by the examination of documents that had an Egyptian or secular date together with a Babylonian or Jewish date. And guess who were the people who had a double calendar? Who are the people who have a double calendar today in the United States, besides the Muslims? But who has a double calendar where they're almost parallel? The answer is the Jews. Well, they were Jews in Egypt who did contract work with the Egyptians, Babylonians, and Persians, and the dates of their documents are dated in the Egyptian or the secular, and in the Babylonian or the Jewish, the holy days, the holy calendar that we have. Out of 17 contracts, the chronology of the historians is right only about 8 times out of 17, 9 times out of 17. The rest of the dates is up to conjecture, and 2 of the dates are out of the pale. They don't work. When you compare that to the Jewish chronology, a book called Seder Olam, written by Rabbi Yossi, the great Tana, the great sage of the Mishnah, one of the 5 great students of Rabbi Akiva, He wrote a book called Seder Olam, the Order of the World. And he has the dates for the establishment of the Second Commonwealth, the dates for the destruction of the First Temple. He has them totally different than modern chronology. When you compare his dates with those documents, those 17 documents, 15 of the documents coincide with his date, and the other two are only a few hours off, meaning that those two documents were written at night while it was in Egypt, or still yesterday, because the day doesn't change till the morning, whereas in the Babylonian, it was the next day, because sundown means a new day. So the Jewish calendar is right, 100%, and the modern historian calendar is wrong. Let that sink in. We're talking about events that took place about 2,500 years ago, 2,400 years ago, the time of Alexander the Great, about 320 years before the Common Era. So it's less than 2,400 years. The Jewish calendar gets it exact. The historians of today get it wrong. In his film, Mahoney's film, Patterns of Evidence, he has two archaeologists from Israel, one from Tel Aviv University and the other from Haifa University. One by the name of Israel Finkelstein, the other Miss Franklin. They both express the belief in the dating system of modern archaeology and history. And they're both wrong. Israel Finkelstein is a noted anti-biblical person from the intelligentsia of Tel Aviv University. He doesn't want the Torah to be right. Therefore, it has to be wrong. Therefore, the Torah or the Bible study never happened. It doesn't start with knowledge. It starts with antagonism. It starts with a perspective. How do I know that? There's another archaeologist whom Mahoney did not ever meet. Her name is Professor Eilat Mazar. Her grandfather was one of the first archaeologists who discovered the maze of tunnels that run under the Temple Mount. And she has discovered David's temple. She has discovered different outposts, industrial outposts, military outposts, contemporaneous with King David, indicating that David wasn't just a nomad chieftain, as Israel Finkelstein asserts, but a powerful king, one who had a large army and an expanding economy, somebody to be reckoned with in the ancient world. How could this be? Well, there's very little of the ancient world that really has been unearthed until now. We've unearthed sites, a lot of sites, but comparatively speaking, there's not a whole lot that we've unearthed. Within what's been unearthed, if your attitude is that this comes from the biblical times and we have to look at the Bible to see if it's true, or how true it is, or this is around the time of the Bible can't be right, so we have to figure out something else. That's the basis of Israel Finkelstein. Israel Finkelstein is a fraud. Every time he says something, Eilat Mizar, 6 months later, has discovered in rock and in mortar proof that undoes his theories. So why should you believe any of his theories? Because he's the professor at Tel Aviv University. He's the guy that goes in a suit and claims to be looking for the truth and only the truth. The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. No. The lie, the whole lie, and nothing but a lie. Because Israel Finkelstein doesn't want the Torah to be true. Therefore, it couldn't be true. It has nothing to do with intellectual honesty. There was a professor by the name of Zertal. Professor Zertal, Zertal, discovered an ancient altar upon what appears to be Mount Eval. The importance of finding this mountain is because it appears that this is the original mountain, the original altar upon which Joshua made a covenant with the children of Israel, with their God. When he discovered it, to come to examine what he discovered, he invited the great archaeologists of his time, including Yigal Yadin, the one who wrote the book on Masada. Yadin came, spent 10 minutes on the site, pumped on his pipe, looked at it, said goodbye. Didn't examine, didn't question. Later on wrote that the findings of Zertal was a farm with a high place to scan the area for marauding groups. In other words, it was a military outpost outside of farmland, and the reason why there was what it looked to be an altar, a high place, was because they needed to see in the distance whether armies were coming. The only problem with that theory is because, A, it's not very high up, and the altar is only in the middle of the mountain. If you're going to make an observation post, you do like the Israelis do today. You put your radar and you put your observation people on the top of the mountain. Anybody familiar with Mount Meron, where the tzaddik, where the holy Tana, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, lies, on the top of that mountain, which is the highest mountain up until 67 in Israel, on top of the mountain are the great radar installations and observation posts where people can look out for the defense of the country. You put them on top, not in the middle, Professor Yadin. And so Zertal became a semi-believer in the Torah because he had discovered a truth in concrete terms that actually paralleled what the Torah says. There was a Professor Kenyon in the 50s who came along and denied the biblical record because her timeline did not allow for Joshua to come into Jericho, which had been destroyed in the 14 or 15 centuries before the Common Era, did not allow for Joshua to come in around the year 1230 or 1250, because had he come at that time, it would have been a desolate place. So says Professor Kenyon. So who says her timeline is right? What's been discovered in Jericho is nothing short of breathtaking. The book of Joshua says, and Jericho was sogeres umusugeres, closed and doubly closed. And the commentaries all struggle with what exactly was this closing and double closing. You only have to look at the ruins and see what was there in Jericho, and you realize Jericho had a high outer wall, a rampart on a slant, and a higher inner wall. Together was over 100 feet tall, but it was a double wall. Sogeret, outer wall, about 40 feet tall, a rampart 30 feet, and another wall 25 to 30 feet. Together it was about 100 feet tall. But the second wall was inside after the incline. Sogeret, Sugeret. And the entire wall system came down. There was no battering rams in those days that could have knocked that wall down. It came down by a sort of earthquake. And after it came down on an incline. And it says the Israelites were able to go into Jericho on top of that incline. If you read the verses, you see exactly how the ruins of Jericho actually give life and meaning to the biblical testimony of Joshua and his people. It says further that they kept the house of Rachav. Rachav was a prostitute who kept her family in her home and the home next door. Where was her home? Her home was in the outer wall. Everything in the outer wall and the inner wall had collapsed except for a couple of houses on the north side. The Torah says that Rechav's house was spared and her family was spared, and they became part of the Jewish people. How did the prophet know this? Because by the time supposedly the book of the prophecy was written, the whole area was covered with rubble and with grass, and there was no way you could see the remnants of those houses. Only after uncovering the site could you see them. Another point. Well, this is also found in the writings of Professor Wood, who was interviewed by Mahoney. Professor Wood found stores of grain, fresh grain, throughout the entire city of Jericho. The whole city had been burned, including the stores, which doesn't make sense, because if you're an army going through from one place to another, Professor Kenyon said the Egyptians came. There's no record of the Egyptians coming, by the way, not anywhere among the Egyptians, but the Egyptians came and destroyed it. Of course, she doesn't know that, but it's better to say they destroyed it than Joshua, because then she'd have to believe in the Bible. But if you're coming from Egypt and you're going several hundred miles to a place of conquest, you've got an army of 10, 20, 30,000 people. You have to feed them. The last thing you do is destroy the storage areas, and you won't be able to replenish your army's food. Why was the stores, which was absolutely necessary for the continuity of an army, why were they burned? The Torah tells you why. Joshua had made a sacred vow. If you give the city in my hand, we will not partake from any of the spoils of the city. We will completely burn it in honor of God. In order to fulfill that promise, they burnt the entire city, including the storage areas, relying on God that God would feed them and not take the grain that was readily available. Anyway, folks, the point being, historians tell you stuff when you go to college, and the basis of what they tell you could be false. Don't take my word for it. Start asking questions and read Rabbi Hull's The Challenge of Jewish History. And you'll begin to see that history taught in the colleges by archaeologists and by historians, and eventually you find the same thing is true with cosmologists, is a house of cards.